Our mission this week is to try and synthesize a whole body of sources that are detailing the current environment, which just feels, well, intensely kinetic.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're waking up every day feeling like things are fundamentally shifting, or maybe even, slipping away or going off the rails, you are definitely not alone in that.
No, that sentiment is really at the core of the sources we're looking at. We're sort of framing this deep dive around this sense of political and even cultural disintegration.
Right.
And the thing that's missing, like you and I were talking about, is a proper scale of public response to all this. It's hard to argue back when the goalposts are moving so fast.
Absolutely. And the sources we've got are excerpts from a discussion that's focused really sharply on that intersection of, major political events. Everything from foreign policy shifts to this really intense domestic unrest.
And the figures driving it.
And the figures driving it, exactly.
So let's just lay out the goal for you. We're diving into 3. Let's call them essential nuggets of knowledge. First, the surprising origin story and ideology of a hugely influential White House figure.
Okay.
Second, the sort of confounding political logic behind what's being called the inverted credibility gap and, why blatant lies seem to actually strengthen power now.
Which is a fascinating idea.
It is. And finally, what the sources are pointing to as the ultimate political distraction that's unfolding right now on the international stage.
Okay, let's unpack that. I think we have to start with the crisis backdrop because it's just incredibly intense. We're seeing these parallel dramas play out. On one hand, you have all this chatter about invading other countries, specifically Venezuela. And at the same time, a paramilitary federal police force is being deployed in American cities. And that's, well, it's leading to people getting hurt.
It's the immediacy of the harm, I think, that really brings it home. We all saw the incident in Minneapolis, an ICE agent shooting a woman in her minivan. Those images, they confirm that using federal forces like this has real, tangible, negative consequences. And you have to wonder, when external powers see this, the sources mention China and Russia, they must just be looking at this domestic instability as a gift.
Just laughing.
Just sitting back, rocking back and forth, laughing. I mean, they're watching the self-inflicted disintegration of American political cohesion.
And as that cohesion phrase, it seems like the internal power structure is relying on more and more extreme figures, which brings us to Stephen Miller.
Right.
He's rapidly becoming, as the sources note, maybe the second most important person in the White House. But his trajectory, how he got there from 2017, that's maybe the most revealing detail.
It really is. You have to remember how he started. The sources say Miller showed up in 2017 as basically an inside joke.
A joke.
He was Steve Bannon's joke on the normies. That's the quote. But it was a dark joke. I mean, Bannon, who gets accused of being a fascist all the time, he reportedly looked at Miller and said, no, this really is a fascist. Yeah, he even compared him to Goebbels. It suggests Miller was seen as the absolute extreme of that wing, even by the people inside it.
It's just stunning that such a key figure could start out as, like, internal political theater. And beyond that origin story, the sources paint a really clear and frankly unsettling character sketch of Miller that we should probably report on.
That sketch it's integral to understanding his influence. They describe him as having this unsettling demeanor, a visible discomfort, in social settings. He avoids eye contact.
And the featureless face thing.
Yeah, the featureless face thing. A description that led one source to say he looked, and I quote, literally like Voldemort. But the takeaway here is how that perceived lack of typical social connection seems to just fuel this incredibly determined singular focus on these cruel anti-immigration policies. His character, as they define it, is inseparable from his ideology.
And that ideology, which he laid out recently when he was talking about Greenland, is just, it's chilling because it rejects the last 70 years of global norms. He said, and I'm quoting here, "We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power."
And this is the point. This is the foundational point we really need to sit with. That statement is what the sources call the pre-World War II view.
The German view.
Exactly. The German view of international relations. The strong rule the weak, and force is the only real currency. The entire post-WWII consensus, which, gave us decades of relative peace, that was the central accomplishment of the U.S. and its allies undoing that exact view.
I mean, you look at institutions like the UN or NATO or global trade agreements. They're all built on the idea that dialogue and shared rules can be more important than just raw military power.
Precisely. So when the second most influential person in the White House articulates a philosophy that just fundamentally rejects all of that in favor of pure power,
Yeah.
you're not talking about a policy tweak anymore.
Yeah.
You're talking about a complete philosophical realignment of American statecraft. It's a rejection of the global operating system that America itself built. And Miller, according to these sources, is the singular architect of this philosophy for a second term.
So let's look at how that ideology of force, of just asserting your own reality, plays out at home. Which brings us back to that Minneapolis incident.
Right.
After the shooting, the president posts on Truth Social, and he describes the victim as a professional agitator and says the driver was, quote, violently, willfully, and viciously running over the ICE officer.
And what's crucial here is that this is just demonstrably, verifiably untrue. It's a direct, outright lie. It completely contradicts the video evidence that was everywhere.
Yeah.
And this takes us back historically to the 1960s and the original credibility gap.
Right. Back in the 60s, that gap happened because of transparent lies, like about winning in Vietnam. It eroded public trust, and it ultimately undermined the whole government's authority.
But here's the profound shift, what the sources are calling the Trump inversion. Today, the president's credibility, if you measure it traditionally, has never been weaker. The lies are more transparent, they're easier to debunk, and yet, it hasn't undermined him.
Quite the opposite, they argue.
Quite the opposite. The sources argue it has actually strengthened him.
Okay, strengthened him. How is that even possible? How can repeated, verifiable lies actually increase someone's political strength?
Well, it seems to work on a few different levels, both psychological and political. First, by insisting on his version of reality so boldly, he's basically testing the loyalty of his base.
So believing the lie becomes a sign of commitment.
It becomes the primary signifier of tribal identity. It filters out anyone who isn't all in. And second, it completely shifts the ground of political debate. Now opponents have to spend all their time and energy arguing over basic, verifiable facts instead of talking about policy.
So if we're all fighting over what the Minneapolis clip actually shows, we're not talking about the policy of deploying paramilitary police in the first place.
Precisely. And in the eyes of his supporters, all the media's fact-checking just confirms their belief that the media is biased against him. The media gets forced into this terrible dynamic. The sources highlighted it with that interesting photo from a recent New York Times interview.
Oh, yeah, the one with the president behind his desk and, what, 5 reporters in the semicircle?
5 reporters. And I see 2 ways to interpret that picture. One, from his perspective, this has to be the apex of his career. The New York Times, an outlet he is obsessed with, sent 5 top reporters. That confirms his immense power.
But the second interpretation is about the challenge the media is facing. I mean, why send 5?
Because they knew they were going to be lied to. You need 5 people there just to check the record, to document what's said, to ensure some kind of accountability in real time. And this dynamic, it contributes to what the sources are calling the normalization of absurdity.
Can you give us an example of that normalization in action?
The coverage of Venezuela is a perfect one. The New York Times reported that the administration announced it had taken over Venezuela, but the report had no meaningful details on how that happened or what the strategic objectives even were.
But isn't the media sort of obligated to cover a policy announcement, no matter how wild it sounds? Where's the line?
That's the tension, right?
Yep.
When you report in a deadpan, objective tone that an administration has done something extremely unconventional, like taking over a country, you can accidentally make that policy sound normal. The media is stuck. They don't have a universal language yet to just say, this is ridiculous, this is fabricated, this was made up on the fly.
So the objective tone risks making the unfounded claims seem real.
Exactly. Simply because it was reported with a straight face.
And speaking of major headlines, the focus right now is just dominated by this Venezuela narrative. It's the drama we're all trying to process.
And that right there is exactly what we should be suspicious of. The sources suggest this whole Venezuela narrative is likely the Trump operation designed specifically to distract from something else.
Yeah. Which is?
The Jeffrey Epstein files.
Oh, the classic maneuver. So we're moving from, this global assertion of power to the domestic fallout of accountability. The key question then is, what is the status of the remaining, 5 million documents, the ones that haven't been released?
And the promise of transparency on that has been severely undermined This is where the political turf war is heating up. Thomas Massie, who's a Republican congressman who actually fought for the release,
Right.
he's now publicly criticizing the White House and figures like Pam Bondi for failing to release enough information. The sources are saying that only about 1% of the total documents have actually been made public.
And the political consequence of that stonewalling?
Well, survivor advocates who fought for years for this are. They're absolutely furious. They see this massive foreign policy drama as a direct attempt to bury a scandal that touches powerful people on both sides of the aisle. The Epstein files are kind of the old, reliable distraction.
Because they involve so many influential people, that the coverage just creates this all-consuming scandal.
That's it. So the sources see this as just standard distraction book politics. When the Epstein scandal, which will inevitably come back because the documents are still there, when that gets too hot, the White House just changes the channel.
This cycle is predictable.
Very. When domestic accountability looms too large, especially a complex scandal that implicates all kinds of elites, you start or you hype up a foreign conflict. It rallies nationalist support, it completely changes the news cycle, and lets the administration look strong and decisive.
That shift brings us to institutional decay and the political turf wars heating up inside Washington itself. We're starting to see these little cracks in the Democratic Party's leadership. Congressman Steny Hoyer, who is 86 years old, is stepping down.
Right.
Which signals that maybe some older leaders are finally starting to, quote, let go of the torch of power.
And while Hoyer has had a very long career, the problem is deeper than just the age of a few people. The sources argue it's the institutional basis of success that's created this lack of competition.
What do you mean by that, the institutional basis? For a listener who doesn't follow the day-to-day of Congress, what does that look like?
It's the calcification of the system. Once someone gets a strong committee chairmanship, they master the funding mechanisms, they build a huge fundraising machine. They become basically unbeatable in their safe district.
So people can stay in Congress for life.
For life.
Yeah.
And the incentive for new, younger, more innovative leaders to rise up just shrinks. And the people in power become, as the sources put it, calcified in their roles. Their solutions are for yesterday's problems, not today's.
Calcified in their roles. That's a powerful image. Moving from that kind of inertia to the military, we have to touch on the controversy around Mark Kelly, who had previously advocated for military personnel to disregard illegal orders. That ignited a huge debate about loyalty and the chain of command.
Yeah, and the expert analysis in the sources really critiques Kelly's position. They call it agitprop, because while the idea of disobeying an illegal order sounds noble, on the merits, it's fundamentally incorrect. Military systems require a very strict adherence to command.
So why call it agitprop or political messaging instead of a legitimate ethical concern?
Because the standard for an order that's illegal and must be disobeyed is extremely high. We're talking about Nuremberg-level situations, genocide, war crimes.
Not just a policy you disagree with.
Exactly. Kelly's suggestion, by encouraging individual discretion in these ambiguous situations, it politicizes the chain of command. It implies every soldier should weigh every order, which is just structurally dangerous. The critique is that he was using a real ethical dilemma as a political tool.
And we're seeing this intense politicization of culture move to younger and younger people. The sources noted the rise of something called Club America.
Yeah, the high school version of Charlie Kirk's Turning Point group.
Right, and it's being actively rolled out in high schools.
Which just raises the question, why are we encouraging organized political activism inside high schools? They're already dealing with so much. Introducing this formalized national political organizing, it just creates an immediate political tug of war between students, staff, and parents. It's an unnecessary division.
And we're seeing that same threat at the highest cultural levels, too. The Smithsonian is apparently at risk of serious institutional corruption.
This is a huge concern. The sources warn that the Smithsonian, which is supposed to be the objective keeper of American history, it's at risk of going the way of the Kennedy Center. An institution whose board gets filled with political appointees who care more about messaging than preservation. If figures like J.D. Vance join the board, there's a real fear of a Trump Smithsonian that, slaps names on wings and actively distorts history to fit a political narrative.
When you put it all together, the calcification of Congress, the politicization of the military, the threat to the Smithsonian, it all comes back to that initial theme of institutional disintegration.
It really does. And the most frustrating part, the thing we keep coming back to, is that feeling that Too much is too much. There is just a systemic, insufficient public response to the scale and speed of all these changes. We're hitting the absolute outside limits of anything the nation has ever experienced.
That leads to the hard question. If we look at the whole situation for America right now, the institutional decay, the foreign policy, the weaponized deceit, and we rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the worst possible scenario. Yeah. What score do you give it based on the sources?
10. A 10.
But that score comes with a really important caveat. We have to understand that bad and very bad are not without limits. Hitting a 10 doesn't mean it stops there. It can be a 10 and still get worse. Think of it like a bestseller list. Just because a book hits #1 doesn't mean it stops selling copies. The magnitude of the crisis we're in is, as one source put it, almost inconceivably bad, and as we saw with the Venezuela distraction, the potential for it to get even worse is extremely high. A difficult, but I guess necessary conclusion from this deep dive. We started this conversation talking about Stephen Miller's demand for a country governed entirely by force, strength, and power, which really does reject that entire post-WWII consensus.
It does.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If America officially rejects that consensus in favor of this new aggressive view, what is the immediate global reaction? Consider not just the policy, but what it means for international relations if that power dynamic fully shifts away from shared norms and toward pure coercion.
Yeah.
What does the world actually look like the day after that shift is made formal?
Something to ponder for sure.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more context and clarity.